At my own granddaughter's wedding, my name tag didn't say grandmother of the bride. It said, the family's walking ATM. I smiled, pinned it to my dress, and walked into the ballroom because sometimes the quietest reaction becomes the beginning of the loudest truth. My name is Margaret Collins. I was 68 years old on the day I learned exactly what my family believed my place was. The ballroom glittered beneath crystal chandeliers that reflected warm golden light across white linen tablecloths and polished silverware. A string quartet played softly near the dance floor while guests admired the floral arrangements that filled the room with the scent of fresh roses and eucalyptus. It should have been one of the happiest afternoons of my life. My granddaughter Emily was marrying the man she loved, and I had spent months looking forward to watching her begin a new chapter. I had chosen a navy blue dress because my late husband, Robert, always said that color made my eyes look brighter. Before leaving home that morning, I stood in front of the mirror a little longer than usual, gently adjusting the pearl necklace he had given me on our 40th wedding anniversary. I could almost hear him telling me to smile because family moments were worth celebrating. I believed him, even after all these years. When I arrived at the reception venue, a smiling young hostess welcomed me to the registration table. She searched through a neat stack of place cards before handing one to me with cheerful confidence. Here you are, Mrs. Collins. Congratulations. I thanked her and glanced down without thinking. My fingers stopped moving. Written in elegant black lettering were 6 words that seemed impossible to understand at first. The family's walking ATM. I stared at the card for several long seconds. Surely someone had made a mistake. Perhaps another guest had received the wrong card, or maybe it was an unfortunate printing error. The hostess noticed my expression and leaned slightly closer. Is everything all right? She asked politely. I forced the smallest smile I could manage. I'm sure it's nothing, I replied. These things happen. She looked relieved, and I pinned the badge onto my dress before walking toward the ballroom. Every step suddenly felt heavier than the one before. I told myself not to overreact. Maybe nobody else would notice. Maybe Emily had never even seen the name tags before they were placed on the welcome table. I wanted to believe that. I truly did. But hope became much harder to hold on to once I entered the reception hall. A few guests glanced toward my chest before quickly looking away. Others exchanged awkward smiles that disappeared almost immediately. One elderly gentleman frowned as though he wanted to say something but thought better of it. I could feel the words hanging there without anyone speaking them aloud. Walking ATM. The phrase echoed inside my mind with every greeting, every handshake, every polite smile. Near the center of the room stood my son David and his wife Melissa, welcoming guests with effortless confidence. Melissa looked radiant in an emerald green dress, greeting everyone as though she had personally orchestrated every perfect detail of the celebration. When her eyes met mine, they lingered for just a fraction of a second on the badge attached to my dress before she smiled brightly and waved. There was something in that smile I had never noticed before. It was too calm. Too prepared. David walked over and kissed my cheek. Mom, you made it, he said warmly. Then his eyes drifted toward my name tag. He paused for the briefest moment before smiling again. You look wonderful. Not a single word about the badge. Not one question. Not one apology. It lasted only a heartbeat, but that silence settled deeply inside me. I suddenly realized that this was not the first time I had felt strangely invisible around my own family. It was simply the first time they had printed it in black ink for everyone else to read. Across the ballroom, photographers gathered relatives together for family portraits. Emily laughed as bridesmaids adjusted her veil while guests admired the elegant decorations. It was a beautiful wedding, and I wanted nothing more than to protect her happiness. So I swallowed the lump in my throat, straightened my shoulders, and quietly walked farther into the room. I refused to let anyone see tears that had not yet fallen. As I reached my assigned table near the back corner of the ballroom, far from the bride and groom, I noticed another detail that made my heart sink. My chair faced away from the head table, almost as though my place in the family had been carefully measured long before I ever walked through those doors. I gently rested my purse on the empty chair beside me and looked around once more. Somewhere inside that crowded ballroom, surrounded by music, laughter, and smiling faces, I felt an unexpected certainty settle over me. The name tag was not the beginning of the story. It was simply the first clue that someone wanted me to notice. I remained in my seat as servers quietly moved between the tables carrying trays of sparkling water and appetizers. Around me, conversations flowed as naturally as the music drifting across the ballroom, but I could no longer hear individual voices. Instead, I noticed the little things I would have ignored years ago. My table was tucked beside a decorative column that partially blocked the view of the bride and groom. Everyone from our immediate family had been seated much closer to the dance floor. Even Robert's younger brother, who rarely attended family gatherings, had a better view than I did. At first I convinced myself it was simply the result of complicated seating arrangements. Weddings were stressful to organize. Mistakes happened. Then I noticed something else. Every place card at my table carried the names of distant relatives, neighbors, and business acquaintances. I was the only close member of the family sitting there. A young couple beside me smiled politely and introduced themselves as friends of the groom's parents. They had no idea who I was until the woman glanced at my name tag. Her smile faded almost instantly. "I thought that was supposed to be a joke," she whispered, looking genuinely embarrassed. "I am sorry. I should not have said anything." I smiled gently and assured her it was all right, although neither of us truly believed that. Across the room, I watched Melissa directing the event coordinator with confident gestures. Every flower arrangement, every speech, every photograph seemed to happen exactly when she wanted. She looked completely at ease, laughing with guests while accepting compliments about the beautiful reception. Every few minutes she glanced around the ballroom, almost as though she were checking whether every detail remained under control. Once again her eyes settled on me. This time she smiled for only a second before turning away. It was a smile without warmth, the kind that exists only for appearances. I remembered the first time I met Melissa almost 20 years earlier. She had seemed thoughtful, ambitious, and eager to become part of our family. Robert welcomed her immediately. I did too. Whenever David struggled financially during those early years of marriage, Robert and I quietly helped them without expecting anything in return. We never kept records because parents are not supposed to count the cost of helping their children. We simply wanted them to succeed. Looking around the ballroom now, I wondered if generosity could slowly become something people expected instead of appreciated. My thoughts were interrupted when the photographer called everyone from the bride's immediate family to gather near the grand staircase. I stood, smoothing the front of my dress before making my way toward the group. Emily spotted me almost immediately. Her face brightened. "Grandma," she called happily. "Come over here. I want you next to me." Before I reached her, Melissa stepped between us with an apologetic expression. "Margaret, we are doing the bridal party first," she said pleasantly. "We will get the extended family pictures afterward." Her voice was calm and friendly enough that nobody else would have questioned it. Emily looked slightly confused but nodded. "Okay. We can do another one later." I stepped back without arguing. A few minutes later I watched cousins, in-laws, college friends, co-workers, and neighbors rotate through different photo combinations while I remained standing quietly near the wall. Nobody invited me into another photograph. Nobody even seemed to notice I was still waiting. Finally, after nearly half an hour, the photographer thanked everyone and announced it was time to prepare for the couple's entrance into the reception. The opportunity had passed. Emily had already been guided toward another room to freshen her makeup before the introductions. She never realized I had not appeared in a single family portrait. I told myself it had simply been an oversight. Yet deep inside, another quiet voice asked how so many oversights could happen in the same afternoon. The name tag. The isolated table. The photographs. None of them alone would have convinced me of anything. Together they formed a pattern that became harder to ignore with every passing minute. While guests applauded as the newlyweds entered the ballroom, I caught sight of an older gentleman standing near the entrance. He wore a charcoal gray suit that looked familiar, although I could not immediately place him. He was not watching the bride or the groom. Instead, he was watching the room itself, carefully observing the guests one by one before his eyes finally rested on me. He gave a small, respectful nod but did not approach. Something about his expression stirred an old memory connected to Robert, one that I could not quite reach. Before I had time to think further, Melissa stepped onto the stage to welcome everyone and thank the families whose support had made the celebration possible. As applause filled the ballroom, I noticed the gentleman quietly take a seat near the back of the room without taking his eyes off me for more than a moment. For reasons I could not explain, I suddenly felt that he had not come merely to celebrate a wedding. The applause slowly faded as dinner service began, and I found myself watching people instead of eating. That was something Robert used to do whenever we attended community events together. He believed that if you paid close enough attention, people would eventually tell you exactly who they were without saying very much at all. I had never fully understood what he meant until that afternoon. Melissa moved gracefully from table to table, accepting compliments about the reception with practiced elegance. Every guest who thanked her for the beautiful celebration received the same warm smile, the same carefully chosen words, and the same effortless charm. Yet every time she approached our family, her attention lingered on conversations about money. One aunt thanked her for organizing such an impressive wedding. Melissa laughed softly and replied, "Well, it certainly helps when the family has always had someone willing to open her wallet." She did not look directly at me, but several guests did. A few chuckled politely while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I lowered my eyes to my untouched dinner plate and quietly folded my napkin across my lap. It would have been easy to convince myself that she meant no harm if not for the dozens of similar moments that suddenly came rushing back into my memory. Years earlier, when David and Melissa had purchased their first home, the bank required a larger down payment than they had expected. Robert and I wrote the check without hesitation because we wanted our son to begin married life without overwhelming financial pressure. Melissa hugged me with tears in her eyes and promised she would never forget our kindness. A few years later, when David decided to leave his stable job and start a small consulting business, the bank considered the venture too risky. Once again, Robert quietly helped secure the financing. He never called it a loan. He simply told David to build something he could be proud of. When Emily dreamed of attending a private university, tuition costs climbed higher every semester. Robert had already passed away by then, but I remembered his final conversation with me. He had squeezed my hand and said, "Whatever happens after I am gone, make sure Emily never has to give up her future because of money." I honored that promise without telling anyone else. Semester after semester, I covered the difference that scholarships could not. I never expected gratitude. I only hoped opportunity would open doors for my granddaughter. Looking across the ballroom now, I realized something painful. Every major milestone our family celebrated had quietly rested on sacrifices that almost nobody remembered anymore. Somewhere along the way, generosity had stopped looking like love and started looking like obligation. As the evening continued, Emily walked from table to table greeting guests. When she reached mine, her smile was as sincere as ever. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "Grandma, thank you for being here. I have barely had a chance to talk to you today." I kissed her forehead and told her she looked beautiful. Before I could say anything more, the wedding coordinator gently interrupted, explaining that the couple needed to prepare for the cake-cutting ceremony. Emily apologized with genuine disappointment and hurried away. She never noticed my unusual name tag because her attention had been pulled in a dozen different directions since early that morning. Watching her disappear into another crowd of smiling guests, I felt certain she was not the architect of what had happened. Someone else had carefully arranged every uncomfortable detail while making sure she remained too busy to notice. My eyes drifted toward the gentleman in the charcoal gray suit once again. He had barely touched his meal. Instead, he occasionally looked toward me with quiet recognition before returning his attention to the room. Finally, during a pause between speeches, he rose from his chair and slowly made his way toward my table. His posture was calm, his expression respectful, and something about the way he carried himself suddenly unlocked a memory I had not visited in years. I had seen that same measured walk beside Robert's hospital room during the final weeks of his life. The gentleman stopped beside my chair and offered a gentle smile. "Mrs. Collins," he said softly, "I do not expect you to remember me after all this time, but my name is Martin Reynolds." My heart skipped. Robert's attorney. The man who had quietly handled our estate planning for decades. Before I could respond, Martin glanced around the ballroom to make certain no one was listening. Then he looked back at me with the same calm expression Robert had trusted for so many years. "Your husband asked me to attend this wedding if certain things ever came to pass," he said. "I have been watching carefully since you arrived. I believe the time has finally come for us to have a private conversation." Martin waited until the applause from the latest speech faded before quietly leading me toward a small sitting area just outside the ballroom. The sounds of laughter and music became softer as the doors closed behind us, leaving only the distant melody of the string quartet and the muted conversations of hundreds of wedding guests. He did not rush to speak. Instead, he allowed me a moment to settle into the upholstered chair across from him. His expression was calm, almost solemn, the same expression I remembered seeing whenever Robert faced an important decision. Martin folded his hands together before speaking. "Margaret," he said gently, "Robert asked me to prepare for a day that he hoped would never come." My heart tightened at the mention of my husband. Even after 6 years, hearing his name spoken with such warmth brought back memories of quiet evenings on our front porch, watching the sunset while planning a future we believed would always include both of us. Martin reached into his leather briefcase but did not remove any documents. Instead, he looked directly at me. "Before I show you anything, I need to ask one question. Has anything happened today that made you feel your family no longer sees you with the respect Robert believed you deserved?" I smiled sadly. "That depends on how much time you have." Martin nodded as though my answer confirmed something he had feared. I told him about the name tag, the isolated seating arrangement, the photographs that somehow managed to exclude me, and the comments about money that seemed harmless to everyone except the person forced to hear them. I did not exaggerate. I simply described the afternoon exactly as it had unfolded. When I finished, Martin remained silent for several moments. "I am sorry," he finally said. Robert worried that generosity might one day become expectation. He often told me that the greatest danger to a kind person is not being taken advantage of once, but being valued only for what they can provide. His words echoed something I had slowly begun to realize during the reception. Martin carefully opened his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope bearing Robert's familiar handwriting. Seeing my husband's name written across the front nearly brought tears to my eyes. Martin handed it to me without saying another word. My hands trembled slightly as I traced the ink with my fingertips. Robert had always written my name in the same careful script, and for a brief moment it felt as though he were sitting beside me once again. I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The first line immediately caught my breath. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then something has happened that finally revealed the difference between being loved and being useful." I paused, unable to continue for several seconds. Martin quietly looked away, giving me the privacy to gather myself. I continued reading. Robert wrote that he had never doubted my kindness, but he feared that some people would eventually mistake my willingness to help for an endless obligation. He reminded me that true family was built upon gratitude, respect, and shared responsibility rather than financial support. Near the end of the letter he asked me not to let guilt keep me from seeing the truth if that truth ever became impossible to ignore. When I finished reading, I carefully folded the letter and held it close to my heart. It felt less like a warning and more like one final conversation with the man who had known me better than anyone else ever could. Martin finally spoke again. "There is more, but Robert instructed me not to discuss it until you had reached your own conclusions. He wanted any decision you made to come from your own heart, not because someone else persuaded you." I looked toward the closed ballroom doors where laughter continued without interruption. Emily was celebrating the happiest day of her life. David was smiling beside his wife. Guests were enjoying dinner, unaware that my entire understanding of my family had quietly shifted over the course of a single afternoon. I took a slow breath and slipped Robert's letter back into its envelope. I said quietly, I finally understand what he was trying to protect me from. Martin gave a small nod. Then perhaps, when the time is right, we can discuss the rest. Together we stood and walked back toward the ballroom, but I was no longer returning. As the same woman who had walked through those doors earlier that afternoon. Margaret and Martin stepped back into the ballroom just as the master of ceremonies invited everyone to enjoy dessert before the evening speeches continued. The cheerful atmosphere had not changed, yet everything looked different through Margaret's eyes. The laughter sounded more distant, the conversations more carefully measured, and the decorations that had seemed so beautiful only an hour earlier now felt like an elaborate stage surrounding a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. She returned to her seat without drawing attention to herself. Martin resumed his place near the back of the room, remaining quietly observant. Neither of them exchanged another word. Robert's letter rested safely inside Margaret's purse, but its message remained close to her heart. She realized that she no longer needed to search for proof that something was wrong. She simply needed the patience to understand how deeply the misunderstanding within her family had taken root. A server placed a slice of wedding cake before her. She thanked him with a gentle smile but left the dessert untouched. Across the ballroom, David stood with several relatives discussing the success of the reception. Margaret watched him laugh, remembering the little boy who used to run into her kitchen after school asking for homemade cookies and stories about his grandfather's childhood. She wondered when that little boy had slowly disappeared beneath the responsibilities of adulthood. She did not believe he had become cruel overnight. More likely, he had become accustomed to receiving help without remembering where it had come from. That thought saddened her more than anger ever could. A few minutes later Melissa approached their table carrying 2 glasses of sparkling cider. She handed one to Margaret with an effortless smile. "I hope you are enjoying yourself," she said warmly. "Everything has been so busy today. I have barely had a chance to check on everyone." Margaret accepted the glass and thanked her. Melissa glanced briefly at the name tag still pinned neatly to Margaret's dress. There was the slightest pause before she spoke again. "People have been talking about that little joke," she said with a soft laugh. "I hope you know nobody meant anything by it. Everyone knows how generous you have always been." Margaret looked at her calmly. "Generosity is most meaningful when it is remembered with gratitude," she replied. Melissa smiled politely, although the expression did not quite reach her eyes. "Of course," she answered before excusing herself to greet another guest. Margaret watched her disappear into the crowd, wondering whether Melissa had heard the full meaning behind those simple words. Soon afterward, Emily hurried over once more, finally finding a quiet moment between photographs and conversations. She knelt beside Margaret's chair and gently squeezed her grandmother's hand. "I feel like I have barely seen you all day," she said. "Thank you for coming. Having you here means more to me than you know." Margaret smiled with genuine affection. "You do not have to thank me, sweetheart. There is nowhere else I would rather be today." Emily noticed the untouched cake and frowned. "Are you feeling all right?" Margaret nodded reassuringly. "Just taking everything in. Weddings have a way of bringing back many memories." Emily rested her head briefly against Margaret's shoulder before another bridesmaid called her name from across the room. She apologized and hurried away once again. Watching her leave, Margaret felt even more certain that Emily had not been responsible for the uncomfortable details of the day. She had simply trusted others to manage the celebration while focusing on beginning her marriage. As the evening continued, Margaret began noticing something she had overlooked before. Whenever guests thanked her for helping the family through difficult years, Melissa gently redirected the conversation toward future plans, expensive renovations, vacations, or investments. The comments were subtle enough that most people paid little attention, but together they revealed an assumption that Margaret's support would always be available whenever needed. It was not spoken as a request. It was treated almost like a permanent fixture of family life. Robert's words returned to her. Once more. There is a difference between being loved and being useful. For the first time, Margaret wondered whether anyone had ever intended to cross that line or whether it had happened so gradually that nobody recognized it until it became part of everyday life. She did not reach a conclusion that evening. Instead, she chose to watch quietly, listen carefully, and allow every conversation to reveal a little more. Whatever Martin still needed to tell her could wait. The evening itself was already answering questions she had been afraid to ask for many years. Margaret remained seated as the conversations around her blended into a gentle hum. The ballroom was still filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and soft music, yet everything seemed quieter than before. Robert's letter rested safely inside her purse, and although she had folded it carefully, every sentence remained vivid in her mind. She no longer felt embarrassed by the name tag pinned to her dress. Instead, it had become a reminder that the truth often revealed itself in the smallest moments. Across the room, David was speaking with several relatives while Melissa welcomed another group of guests with the same polished smile she had worn throughout the afternoon. Nothing about her expression suggested regret or uncertainty. She appeared completely confident that the day had unfolded exactly as she intended. Margaret watched without resentment. She realized that anger would not change what had already happened. Understanding would. A few moments later, Martin quietly approached her table once again. He did not interrupt immediately. Instead, he waited until the nearby guests became absorbed in another conversation before taking the empty chair beside her. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently. Margaret smiled faintly. "Better than I expected." Martin nodded. Robert always believed that once you saw the truth clearly, you would know exactly how to respond. Margaret looked toward the dance floor where Emily and her husband were sharing their first dance. The young couple laughed naturally, completely unaware of the emotional undercurrent flowing through the reception. "I do not want today to become a painful memory for Emily," Margaret said quietly. "She deserves to remember her wedding with happiness." "Robert hoped you would say that," Martin replied. He loved her very much. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments before Martin spoke again. "There is one more thing I believe you should know. Robert never wanted his estate to divide the family. He wanted it to protect the people he loved. That is why every important decision was placed in your hands after his passing. He trusted your judgment completely." Margaret lowered her eyes thoughtfully. She remembered the countless evenings she and Robert had spent discussing their family, never imagining that generosity could one day become a source of misunderstanding. "I kept wondering whether I had done something wrong," she admitted softly. "Perhaps I helped too often. Perhaps I made it too easy for everyone to depend on me." Martin shook his head. "Kindness is never the mistake. Forgetting to appreciate it is." Those simple words settled gently into Margaret's heart. For the first time that afternoon, she felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. She could not change the past, but she could decide what the future would look like. The music changed as guests applauded the newly married couple. Emily walked through the ballroom greeting relatives once again, eventually making her way toward Margaret. This time she sat beside her grandmother without anyone interrupting. "Grandma," she said with a warm smile, "I finally have a quiet minute. I feel like I have been running all day." Margaret laughed softly. "That usually means it was a successful wedding." Emily reached for her grandmother's hand. "I hope you have enjoyed today." Margaret looked at the young woman she had watched grow from a curious little girl into a confident bride. There was kindness in Emily's eyes, the same kindness Robert had always encouraged. "The most important part of today is seeing you happy," Margaret answered honestly. Emily squeezed her hand. "That means more to me than you know." As Emily returned to greet another group of guests, Margaret noticed Melissa watching from across the ballroom. Their eyes met. Briefly. Melissa offered another courteous smile, but this time Margaret simply returned a calm nod before looking away. She no longer felt the need to search for approval or explanations. Sometimes people revealed themselves not through dramatic moments but through ordinary choices repeated over many years. The evening continued with speeches, music, and celebration, while Margaret quietly reflected on everything she had witnessed. Robert's letter had not told her what decision to make. It had simply reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. Love should never require a person to surrender dignity. Generosity should always remain a gift, never an expectation. As the lights shimmered across the ballroom and families gathered together on the dance floor, Margaret realized that this wedding was marking more than the beginning of Emily's marriage. It was also becoming the beginning of a new chapter in her own life, one shaped not by obligation but by wisdom, self-respect, and the quiet confidence that Robert had believed she possessed all along. Margaret remained near the edge of the dance floor as the evening slowly moved toward its final celebrations. The music had become softer, and many guests were now sharing stories instead of formal speeches. Children laughed near the dessert table while older relatives gathered around coffee and tea. From a distance, everything looked like the perfect family wedding. Yet Margaret now understood that appearances could be wonderfully convincing. She quietly removed the name tag from her dress and slipped it into her purse beside Robert's letter. She did not want to throw it away. One day it would remind her of the exact moment she stopped confusing silence with acceptance. As she looked across the ballroom, she noticed David walking toward her with 2 cups of coffee. He smiled naturally as he handed one to her. "I finally escaped for a minute," he said with a tired laugh. "I do not think I have sat down all day." Margaret accepted the cup and thanked him. For several moments they simply watched the guests enjoying themselves. David eventually broke the silence. "Mom, I know today has probably felt overwhelming. Weddings always become a little chaotic." Margaret looked at him carefully. She recognized the familiar kindness in his face, but she also recognized something else. He genuinely believed nothing important had happened. That realization hurt more than deliberate cruelty ever could. "David," she asked gently, "did you notice the name tag they gave me?" His expression changed slightly. "I saw it," he admitted. "I thought someone was trying to be funny." "Did you think it was appropriate?" she asked quietly. David hesitated. "I suppose I should have said something." Margaret nodded slowly. "You should have." There was no anger in her voice. Only honesty. David lowered his eyes into his coffee cup. "I am sorry, Mom." She believed he meant those words, but she also understood that apologies mattered most when they were followed by understanding. Before either of them could continue, Melissa approached with the confident smile she had worn throughout the reception. "There you both are," she said cheerfully. "Everyone is getting ready for one last family photograph before the evening wraps up." Margaret remained calm. "I thought the family photographs were already finished." Melissa gave a brief laugh. "The photographer had a little extra time available." Margaret smiled politely. "How thoughtful." The 3 of them walked together toward the grand staircase where several relatives had already gathered. Emily immediately noticed her grandmother and hurried over. "Grandma," she said warmly, "I want you standing right beside me this time." Margaret smiled and placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. "I would be honored." As everyone settled into position, the photographer adjusted the lighting and asked people to move slightly closer together. Melissa quietly suggested that Margaret stand near the far end of the group to make room for others in the center. Before Margaret could respond, Emily shook her head with surprising confidence. "No," she said kindly but firmly. "My grandmother belongs beside me." The conversation lasted only a few seconds, yet several nearby relatives noticed it. Melissa smiled politely and stepped aside without arguing. Margaret took her place beside Emily while David silently watched the exchange. The camera captured several beautiful photographs, but Margaret barely noticed the flashes. Instead, she noticed Emily reaching over to hold her hand between pictures. It was a simple gesture, completely natural, yet it carried more meaning than any speech given that evening. After the photographs ended, Emily looked at her grandmother with quiet concern. "Grandma, did something happen today?" she asked softly. Margaret could have answered immediately. She could have told Emily about the name tag, the seating arrangement, the missed photographs, and every uncomfortable moment that had followed. Instead, she gently squeezed her granddaughter's hand. "Today belongs to you," she replied. "There will be another time for longer conversations." Emily studied her face for a moment before nodding. "Promise me we will have that conversation." "I promise," Margaret answered. As Emily returned to greet more guests, Martin caught Margaret's eye from across the ballroom. He offered a small nod of understanding, almost as though he knew she had made the right decision. Margaret realized she no longer needed dramatic confrontations or public arguments. The truth had already begun revealing itself through ordinary moments. David had noticed more than he admitted. Emily had trusted her instincts. Even Melissa's carefully controlled confidence had begun to show small cracks whenever events unfolded beyond her expectations. Standing beneath the warm lights of the ballroom, Margaret felt something she had not experienced all afternoon. It was not triumph. It was not satisfaction. It was peace. She finally understood that respect could never be purchased, borrowed, or demanded. It had to be freely given, and if it disappeared, no amount of generosity could bring it back. That quiet realization became the most valuable gift she received at her granddaughter's wedding. The reception gradually settled into the comfortable rhythm that always comes near the end of a joyful celebration. The dance floor remained full, conversations drifted from table to table, and the musicians played familiar melodies that encouraged guests to linger a little longer. Margaret stood near one of the ballroom windows, watching the city lights shimmer beyond the glass. For the first time since arriving that afternoon, she felt no need to hide her emotions. She had spent years believing that love meant always saying yes, always making life easier for everyone else, and never allowing herself to become a burden. Robert's letter had quietly challenged that belief, and the lessons of the day had confirmed it. Behind her, she heard gentle footsteps. Emily approached carrying 2 small slices of wedding cake on delicate white plates. She smiled with the warmth Margaret had loved since the day her granddaughter was born. "I noticed you never finished dessert," Emily said. "I thought maybe we could finally enjoy a piece together." Margaret accepted the plate with a grateful smile. "I think that is the best idea I have heard all day." They stood side by side near the window while the celebration continued around them. Emily remained unusually quiet before finally speaking again. "Grandma, I know you said we could talk another day, but I cannot stop thinking about how different you seemed this afternoon. Something happened before the ceremony even started, did it not?" Margaret looked at the young woman beside her. She could see genuine concern in Emily's eyes, not curiosity or suspicion. She deserved honesty, but she also deserved kindness. Margaret slowly removed the folded name tag from her purse and handed it to her granddaughter without saying a word. Emily unfolded it carefully. Her smile disappeared almost immediately. She read the words again as though hoping she had misunderstood them. "Grandma," she whispered, "who would do something like this?" Margaret answered calmly. "I do not know who ordered it. I only know it should never have happened." Emily looked around the ballroom in disbelief before lowering her voice. "Why did nobody tell me?" "Because everyone was busy making sure your wedding was beautiful," Margaret replied gently. "And I wanted it to stay that way." Emily shook her head. "You should never have been treated this way. Not today. Not ever." Tears gathered in her eyes, but Margaret reached over and squeezed her hand before they could fall. "Listen to me," she said softly. "This day is still beautiful because you married the man you love. Do not let my experience become the memory that overshadows your wedding." Emily nodded, although the sadness remained on her face. A few moments later David approached them. He noticed the folded card in Emily's hand and immediately recognized it. His expression changed as he quietly asked, "You showed her?" Margaret nodded once. Emily turned toward her father. did you know about this? David hesitated before answering honestly. I saw it earlier, but I thought it was someone's poor attempt at humor. I should have spoken up. I did not, and I regret that. Emily looked disappointed rather than angry. Dad, sometimes silence hurts almost as much as the words themselves. David lowered his head. You are right. The three of them stood together for several quiet moments. Across the ballroom, Melissa noticed them talking. She began walking toward the group, but her confident pace slowed as she realized their conversation had become serious. When she reached them, Emily calmly held up the name tag. Melissa, she asked, have you seen this before? Melissa looked at the card for a brief moment. I noticed it earlier, she admitted carefully. I assumed someone in the planning team thought it would be a harmless joke because your grandmother has always been so generous. Emily's expression remained composed. It was not harmless. Melissa seemed surprised by the firmness in her voice. If it caused pain, then I truly wish it had never been used. Margaret listened quietly. She could not know whether those words came from genuine regret or simple embarrassment, but she appreciated that no one argued or dismissed what had happened. Sometimes acknowledging a wound was the first step toward healing it. Martin watched the exchange from a respectful distance without interfering. He understood that this conversation belonged to the family. As the final song of the evening began, Emily slipped her arm through Margaret's and smiled gently. Grandma, when people remember today, I hope they remember how much you have always loved this family. That is how I will remember it. Margaret smiled through grateful eyes. Robert had once told her that truth did not always arrive with dramatic speeches or life-changing announcements. Sometimes it appeared quietly, carried by a sincere apology, an honest conversation, or the courage of one person choosing compassion over pride. Standing beside her granddaughter, Margaret realized that despite the disappointment of the day, those quiet moments were finally beginning to appear. The final guests slowly gathered their coats as the reception drew to a close, and the joyful sounds that had filled the ballroom all evening softened into quiet conversations and warm farewells. Margaret stood for a moment beneath the crystal chandeliers, taking one last look around the room. Earlier that afternoon she had entered carrying nothing but excitement for her granddaughter's wedding. She was leaving with something far more valuable than she had expected. She was leaving with clarity. The evening had not erased the hurt she felt when she first looked down at the name tag pinned to her dress, nor had it erased the disappointment of realizing how easily years of generosity had been taken for granted. Yet it had also revealed something she could not ignore. Emily's kindness was genuine. David had found the courage to acknowledge his silence. Even Melissa, although reserved and visibly uncomfortable, had recognized that what happened should never have taken place. None of those moments could change the beginning of the day, but together they offered hope that the future did not have to resemble the past. Emily walked over one last time before she and her husband prepared to leave for their honeymoon. Without saying anything at first, she wrapped both arms around her grandmother and held the embrace for several long seconds. Margaret closed her eyes and returned the hug, remembering the little girl who once climbed into her lap with bedtime books almost too large for her tiny hands. Some things, she realized, never truly disappeared. Love remained recognizable even after difficult seasons. Emily stepped back and smiled through moist eyes. Thank you for everything you have done for me throughout my life, she said quietly. Not only today. Everything. Margaret gently brushed a loose strand of hair away from her granddaughter's face. Your grandfather and I never gave because we expected anything in return, she replied. We gave because loving you was one of the greatest joys of our lives. Emily nodded. I promise I will never forget that. Nearby, David approached with an expression Margaret had not seen in many years. It was not the confident smile he wore during family gatherings or the busy expression of someone trying to manage responsibilities. It was simply the face of a son who had begun to understand his mother's quiet sacrifices. Mom, he said softly, I know one conversation cannot fix everything, but I hope this is the beginning of doing better. Margaret looked at him with gentle honesty. Doing better always begins with seeing clearly. Today helped all of us see things we ignored for too long. David nodded in agreement. He did not offer excuses. He did not attempt to explain away the events of the afternoon. Instead, he simply embraced his mother, and for the first time in a long while, the embrace felt free of obligation. A short distance away, Melissa slowly approached. Her confident composure had faded, replaced by something quieter. "Margaret," she began carefully, "I have been thinking about today, and I realize I became so focused on planning the perfect celebration that I failed to consider how some choices would affect the people who mattered most. I am truly sorry that you felt disrespected." Margaret listened without interrupting. She understood that trust was rebuilt through consistent actions rather than carefully chosen words, yet sincere apologies still deserved to be heard. "Thank you for saying that," she replied calmly. "Respect grows in the small moments. I hope we both remember that." Melissa nodded with genuine humility. Neither woman expected everything to change overnight, but both understood that honest conversations often began with simple acknowledgments instead of dramatic confrontations. Martin quietly joined them near the ballroom entrance, smiling as he observed the family standing together. Before leaving, he handed Margaret the sealed envelope containing Robert's letter once more. "Keep this somewhere safe," he said. "He wanted it to guide you whenever you questioned your own worth." Margaret slipped the letter into her purse beside the folded name tag. One represented the deepest hurt she had experienced that day. The other represented the wisdom that helped her rise above it. Together they would remind her never again to confuse generosity with responsibility or silence with peace. As she stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted her with a gentle breeze. The city lights shimmered across the quiet streets, and the distant sounds of celebration faded behind the closed ballroom doors. Margaret paused before walking to her car and looked up at the clear night sky. She imagined Robert smiling with the quiet confidence he always carried, knowing she had finally learned the lesson he hoped she would never need. Family was never measured by financial support, expensive gifts, or grand celebrations. Family was measured by gratitude, respect, kindness, and the willingness to stand beside one another with open hearts. Margaret smiled peacefully, started the engine, and drove home knowing that while weddings celebrated the beginning of new marriages, this one had quietly marked the beginning of a new chapter in her own life, one guided not by obligation, but by dignity, wisdom, and a heart finally at peace.